Here is Van Dieman's Pepperberry, and I don't know what a Pepperberry is, but it is probably the best purple I have seen from Van Dieman's. This has no tone shift as paper changes, no shading, and it is boring and predictable in all of the best ways. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, you should generally be avoiding with this ink, and I'm going to leave it as enough said there. I'm happy using this ink in the tone that I see on the page. I'm really just enjoying it. Dark, but certainly not so dark as the swatch. Just a beautiful, boring purple I really do want a bottle of.
The pen for today is a Cross Wanderlust. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we see that very dark, beautiful purple with no feathering, no spread, no shading, looking absolutely outstanding on this bright white Clairfontaine paper. I can't say enough good for what this looks like. Looking at the back of the page, I see no problems with bleeding or ghosting.
Van Dieman's makes more than just this one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Van Dieman's.
Here is Van Dieman's Huon Pine. Here is Van Dieman's Eclipse. Here is Van Dieman's Pink Radish. Here is Van Dieman's Apple Cider.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does not shade, does look absolutely fantastic. I bet if you were using this ink on this paper, your story would be even more interesting. Looking at the back of the page, we see it does get quite deep into the paper very frequently, never bleeding through touching the page underneath, but enough to be problematic. Perhaps even enough to stop you from writing on the back of the page, even though the ghosting is not a problem.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does feather. Many different ways, look at 3, before, question, many areas you can find feathering going on. There's no real spread, as in the spread that's there so minor it's not a problem at all. There's no shading. The no tone variation simply means, or the no tone shift from one paper to this one simply means that we have a very opaque ink. Looking at the back of the page, you see quite a bit of ghosting, quite a bit of spotting. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath, but I don't believe that you would be able to take any notes back here, not without ruining both sides.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get to see the same tone as the Clairfontaine that does not feather, does not spread, does not shade, does stand out against the quad rule without any kind of problem, really making that quad rule disappear into the background. Looking at the back of the page, now, I'm going to point it out, just being nitpicky, there are a couple spots it gets deeper into the paper. Nowhere near the idea of penetrating all the way through. It does not bleed. I'm going to say you could easily continue your notes back here. It's just, be aware, it's a common Van Dieman's problem.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more violet or purple inks.
Here is Colorer's Pillars of Creation. Here is Noodler's Violet. Here is Robert Oster Hippo Purple. Here is Sailor Studio 653.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a Composition Lab notebook.
Here, the tone we get is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, just coming across a bit flatter as a tone. Still very, very nice with no feathering, no spreading. It does have a tiny bit of shading that does come in a little bit. Take a look at multiplication, where the mull is a little bit lighter in tone than the tiplication at the end. So it just doesn't really. Don't go, you'd have to look for it. Most of it, beautiful, dark, consistent purple. Standing out against the quad rule with no problem. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We have a good ink for students to use.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Noodler's Green. Here is Jeherban Stormy Gray. Here is Pilot Kosomosu or Cosmos. Here is Dieman Amber. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather. It does have a minor bit of acceptable spread, considering that we're looking at copy paper. It doesn't shade. I'm going to say mostly what we're seeing is very nice. You might consider this if this is the paper that you regularly look for. I would just think that, choose the pen well. This doesn't look too bad. I'd still use it. Looking at the back of the page, very nice performance with minimal ghosting. No over penetration, really. I don't want to pick on it and saying, look at this, look at this. This is a very good performance for this ink on this paper, makes it a good combination.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This Cross Wanderlust has a fine nib that writes a little on the dry side and delivers an amazing purple that just has me wanting to write more. Off camera, I tried this in a medium flow fine, and the tone did darken and somehow became even better looking. So I think any fine with a medium flow will give you a dark purple with no shading that will make you proud of the words you put on the page. But a dry fine will also look amazing. I would avoid a wet pen with this ink because it's a Van Dieman's, so it could be aggressive. Enjoy.